right, so I thought to start off with, for the people out there who may not know your background, would you be able to give us a bit of a brief overview of your activities before starting the CES?
Gee, how far back do you want to go? Yeah, and how many years back? Because you've probably seen the film, so you know more or less what the story is about.
I've seen the film, but I think there's other people
Mm.
who have no idea what you got up to before you created the CES for us.
Okay,
So
well, to
just
cut a
a
very, very,
summary.
very long story short, I mean,
Yes.
I was, I grew up as a normal middle-class white South African in the 1970s and so on, and then during the 1970s, I kind of woke up and realized what was happening in this country and got involved with the anti-apartheid struggle. So that actually meant leaving the country and making contact with the banned organizations, in particular the ANC. And then I came back to South Africa in the mid-1970s and was active doing underground work for the ANC, and that involved setting up kind of a propaganda shop, a small cell of two people, and we distributed ANC literature around the country using all kinds of novel methods, because you couldn't openly stand on the street corner and do that. So we used things called leaflet bombs, which are not really bombs, but just small explosive devices that would hurl leaflets up into the air, and all kinds of innovative ways of tossing leaflets out of buildings and so on. We're doing that for 2.5 years, and eventually got arrested, and there was a trial, and I was sentenced to 12 years in prison.
So that's quite interesting. So you're sentenced to 12 years, but how many years did you end up serving?
Okay, so they sent us off to Pretoria prison, which is in Pretoria, obviously. It's quite far from where I live in Cape Town. And it was a special prison for white male political prisoners. You must remember, this is the heyday of apartheid, so everybody had their own prison. Every colour had their own prison, and Nelson Mandela and Africans were essentially on the famous Robben Island, which is a small island off the coast of Cape Town, here where I live. Pretoria is far inland, and I was there for 18 months of my 12-year sentence, and the reason why I served a reduced sentence was because I escaped from prison after 18 months.
Nice work.
So I escaped out of prison. That's another very long story, and there's a movie about it, which I will bring with me. And I lived in exile in the UK for exactly 12 years, which was the length of my sentence. So for me, that's how I served my sentence, by living in London, which was not much better than Pretoria, for me at least. Yeah, so I was involved still I was working for the ANC in London, got involved in some serious underground projects, mainly to do with the communication of activists in the country and the ANC headquarters, which was in Zambia and Lusaka. And all the communications had to go through London. So we set up this was the 1980s, early 1990s, and we set up our own kind of novel sort of internet. This was before the real internet started. We had this underground communication system using encryption between South Africa and Zambia via London. And we were even able to penetrate Nelson Mandela's prison. And he was actually on our network sending messages to the leadership in Lusaka at the same time that he was negotiating the terms of his release with the South African regime. And they thought they were talking to Nelson Mandela as an individual, and as it turned out, they were talking to the ANC. without realizing that he was communicating everything that they were saying to him via our underground network to Lusaka.
It's just incredible.
Okay, so then the ANC and all the political organizations were unbanned in 1990. Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and we were all indemnified to return to South Africa. It took me a bit longer. I returned at the end of 1991 because I had to get special permission as I was still an escaped convict, you know. And then I returned, and I would continue to work for the ANC until the first democratic elections in 1994. And while I was living in Johannesburg working for the ANC, there was a guy who'd been in Australia and had some experience with LETs. And he wrote this article in the local Sunday paper, and I was fascinated by this thing. And I went along, he held a meeting in the local library, and a lot of people turned up to hear what this LETs thing was about. And to me, it just sounded fascinating. It was the first time I'd ever come across this notion of alternative currencies. And I thought I'd try it out, you know. So
who was that guy?
I can't remember his name now. I'd have to look it up.
Was he Australian or?
No, he was South African, but
Okay.
he lived in Australia for some while.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd had quite a lot of experience with LETs. Anyway, we started this LETs group. It wasn't terribly successful because it was very much a kind of middle-class thing, people offering things that were not very inspiring, you know, things like conflict resolution. I just wanted someone to come and paint my flat, you know, and to do the plumbing and stuff like that. Anyway, it taught me about the system, and of course it was all very manual in those days because this was before the internet and before everybody had computers. And we used to just use paper checks, and there was a monthly directory of offerings. Pretty much typical standard LETs. And then what happened? This thing, as I say, wasn't very successful. Anyway, I left Johannesburg at that stage and moved back to Cape Town. I was running the ANC's office in Cape Town. And all the time I had this idea of starting a LETs group in Cape Town. But I didn't know many people here. All my former friends and so on had all moved on, immigrated to other countries and all kinds of things. And eventually I discovered this outfit called the South African New Economics Network. And they were also discussing and investigating LETs and alternative monetary forms and monetary reform and so on. And then they invited this guy, James Tarris. You've probably heard of him.
Yep.
He was invited to South Africa and come and talk about LETs, and there were a number of meetings, and he spoke on radio, and it generated a lot of interest. Everybody thought this was a fascinating idea, and we set up a steering committee to create a LETs group in Cape Town, and it just happened that I'd been playing around. This was 2002. I'd been experimenting with some LETs software. And I developed my own even before Tarris came to South Africa. And I already had this thing working, and when we set up this committee, I showed them the software, and everybody was quite inspired by this. So this was 2002. The internet had been going for 4 or 5 years. A bit longer than that, about 6 years. And we started our LETs group using this software, which made life a lot easier, because I remembered back to those days in Johannesburg where everything was manual, you know. And now, instead of the administrator doing all the work, the people, the members themselves were in charge of their own accounts, so they could enter their trades and they could look up online all the offerings and the wants. And it just took off, you know. Within a few months we had a couple of hundred members, which seemed to be quite a lot at that time. I'd heard a lot about groups maybe reaching a few hundred members and then administrators not being able to administer so many people because it was all by hand. And we were expecting this thing to fall over when we reached about 300 members, but it just kept on growing, 300, 500,000, and it just kept going and getting bigger and bigger. And then we started to get interest from around the world. Well, first from other places in South Africa. We set up alternative groups in Johannesburg and all the major cities around South Africa. But there was no way of intertrading between these groups. Each one was a separate entity, pretty much the standard Let's format. And the next year, I think it started with an Australian group who had heard about it